Rain poured heavily outside Mason Carter's garage. Business had been slow for weeks. The small repair shop sat on the edge of town, squeezed between an abandoned warehouse and an old tire store. Most people drove past without noticing it. But for Mason, it was everything. The garage paid the bills. It kept food on the table. And most importantly, it helped him raise his 10-year-old daughter, Lily. Ever since his wife passed away 6 years earlier, Mason had done everything alone. School runs. Doctor appointments. Homework. Running the garage. Some days he barely slept. But he never complained. One evening, as Mason was closing the shop, his phone buzzed. A news alert appeared. Blackstone Luxury Motors announces project shutdown after 3 years of failed development. Mason opened the article. Blackstone was the largest luxury dealership group in the state. Its CEO, Veronica Steele, had invested millions into developing a high-performance engine for a new sports car line. According to the article, dozens of engineers had worked on the project. Yet the engine kept failing during endurance testing. 3 years. Millions of dollars. No solution. The company had officially abandoned the project. Mason read every word carefully. Something caught his attention. The article included a brief description of the failure symptoms. Engine overheating. Power loss. Unexpected shutdowns. The details sounded strangely familiar. Almost too familiar. Mason frowned. He walked toward his workbench and opened an old notebook. Years ago, he had encountered a similar issue while rebuilding a racing engine for a local track team. Most mechanics blamed the cooling system. They were wrong. Mason stared at the notes. Could Blackstone be making the same mistake? The next morning, curiosity got the better of him. He drove to Blackstone's headquarters. The building was enormous. Glass walls. Luxury vehicles. Corporate banners everywhere. Inside, employees rushed around carrying documents and laptops. Mason approached the reception desk. "I'd like to speak with someone about the discontinued engine project." The receptionist looked confused. "Do you have an appointment?" "No." She smiled politely. "Then I'm sorry, sir." Before Mason could leave, another voice interrupted. "What's this about?" A woman in an expensive business suit approached. It was Veronica Steele herself. The CEO. She had overheard the conversation. Mason explained. "I think I might know what's causing the failures." Several nearby employees laughed. Veronica raised an eyebrow. "You do?" Mason nodded. "I'd like to take a look." One executive smirked. "The best engineers in the country couldn't fix it." Another chuckled. "And a small-town mechanic thinks he can." The group laughed. Veronica folded her arms. "What dealership do you work for?" "I own a garage." That triggered even more laughter. The CEO smiled. Not cruelly. Just skeptically. "You understand we've spent 3 years on this project?" "Yes." "And you think you can solve it?" Mason looked calm. "I think I can find the real problem." The room grew quiet. Veronica studied him. Something about his confidence felt different. He wasn't arrogant. He wasn't trying to impress anyone. He genuinely believed what he was saying. Finally, Veronica made a decision. "Fine." The executives looked shocked. "One night." She pointed toward the research facility. "You get 1 night with the engine." The room fell silent. "If you find something useful, we'll talk." Mason nodded. "That's all I need." What nobody in that building knew was that the abandoned engine was hiding a secret flaw. A flaw so simple that hundreds of experts had overlooked it. And by sunrise, everything would change. That evening, Mason was escorted into Blackstone's research facility. The building was unlike anything he had ever seen. Rows of computers. Advanced diagnostic equipment. Testing chambers worth millions of dollars. Everything looked state-of-the-art. Yet in the center of the room sat the engine that had defeated everyone. The project known internally as Phoenix X. 3 years of work. Millions in development costs. And now officially abandoned. Several engineers stayed behind to watch. Not because they believed Mason would succeed. Because they wanted to see him fail. One engineer whispered to another. "He won't last an hour." Another laughed. "I give him 30 minutes. Mason ignored them. He walked around the engine slowly, studying it from every angle. Unlike the others, he didn't start with the computer systems. He didn't connect diagnostic tools. He simply observed. The engineers exchanged confused looks.
Hello friends, welcome to my channel. Enjoy the video.
After 20 minutes, Mason asked for every test report from the last 3 years. The room fell silent. "Every report?" one engineer asked. "Yes." The documents filled several boxes. Most people would have spent weeks reviewing them. Mason sat down and began reading. Hour after hour. Failure reports. Temperature charts. Stress test results. Power delivery logs. Thousands of pages. Around midnight, something caught his attention. A tiny detail. A pattern. One that appeared repeatedly across multiple failures. Yet no report mentioned it directly. Mason smiled. "There you are." An engineer overheard him. "What did you find?" Mason didn't answer. Instead, he walked toward the engine. For the next hour, he carefully inspected a section of the system nobody seemed interested in. Not the cooling system. Not the fuel system. Not the electronics. Something much smaller. Something everyone assumed couldn't possibly be responsible. At 2 a.m., he requested a maintenance camera. One of the engineers handed it over. Mason inserted the tiny camera deep inside a narrow passage. The screen displayed live images. He moved carefully. Slowly. Then suddenly stopped. His eyes narrowed. "That's impossible." The engineer beside him looked confused. "What is it?" Mason turned the screen toward him. The engineer's face immediately changed. "No way." They called over another engineer. Then another. Within minutes, a crowd had formed around the monitor. Nobody could believe what they were seeing. For 3 years, the engine had been tested, disassembled, rebuilt, redesigned, and analyzed. Yet somehow everyone had missed it. A manufacturing defect. Tiny. Almost invisible. But devastating. A component inside the engine had been installed slightly out of alignment during an early prototype assembly. The error was so small that it passed every inspection. Yet under prolonged operation, it created a chain reaction that caused overheating and power loss. 3 years of engineering work. Destroyed by a defect smaller than a coin. One engineer sat down in disbelief. "We never checked that." Another shook his head. "We didn't even think to look there." Mason smiled. "Because you were searching for a complicated answer." The room became silent. At 4 a.m., Mason carefully corrected the alignment. Then he reassembled the engine. Everyone watched. Nobody spoke. By sunrise, the work was finished. The engineers looked nervous. After all, this was the moment that mattered. The moment of truth. At exactly 6:12 a.m., Mason stepped back. The engine was ready. One engineer turned the key. The engine started instantly. The room froze. For several seconds, nobody moved. The engine sounded smoother than anyone had ever heard. Stable. Powerful. Perfect. But the real test was still ahead. The engine had started before. The real problem appeared under stress. And in just a few hours, Veronica Steele would arrive to witness the most important test in company history. At 8 a.m., Blackstone's testing facility was packed. Engineers lined the observation deck. Executives filled the conference room overlooking the test chamber. Everyone wanted to see what would happen. 3 years of failure had made people cautious. Nobody was celebrating yet. Not even Mason. The engine had started perfectly. But starting wasn't enough. It needed to survive a full endurance test. The same test that had destroyed every previous version. A few minutes later, Veronica Steele arrived. The CEO walked directly into the control room. Her eyes immediately found the monitoring screens. The engine was already running. Smoothly. Quietly. Efficiently. Several engineers approached her. "Ma'am, you need to see this." They explained what Mason had discovered. The tiny manufacturing defect. The misaligned component. The cause of 3 years of failures. Veronica listened carefully. Then she looked toward Mason. The small-town mechanic stood quietly near the back of the room. No bragging. No celebration. Just watching the data. For the first time, Veronica realized something. This man wasn't trying to prove anyone wrong. He was trying to solve a problem. A difference many people never understand. The endurance test began. Hour 1. Everything looked perfect. Temperature levels remained stable. Power output exceeded expectations. Fuel efficiency improved. Engine vibration dropped significantly. The engineers exchanged cautious smiles. Hour 2. Still perfect. Several executives began whispering excitedly. Investors who had previously abandoned the project started sending messages. The atmosphere changed. Hope returned. Hour 3. No issues. No warnings. No overheating. No shutdowns. The same test that had defeated dozens of experts was now being passed with ease. Veronica smiled for the first time that day. Then suddenly, a warning light flashed on the main monitor. The room froze. One alarm. Then another. The engineers immediately rushed to their stations. Temperature readings were rising. Not rapidly, but enough to cause concern. The excitement vanished. Panic returned. No. One engineer stared at the screen. It can't be happening again. Another shook his head. We fixed the defect. The room became chaotic. Questions flew everywhere. What failed? Where is the problem? Is the project finished? Veronica looked toward Mason. Unlike everyone else, he wasn't panicking. He wasn't even surprised. He continued studying the monitor. Then he smiled. A small smile. The kind that appears when a mystery finally makes sense. One engineer noticed. Why are you smiling? Mason pointed toward the screen. Because the engine isn't failing. The room fell silent. What? The engine is working exactly as it should. Nobody understood. The temperature was clearly rising. The alarms were active. Every indicator suggested another disaster. Mason walked toward the control console. Then he revealed something nobody had considered. The problem wasn't the engine. The problem was the testing system itself. And once the engineers realized what Mason had discovered, they would understand that the entire 3-year project had been built on a false assumption. The control room was silent. Everyone stared at Mason. The warning alarms continued flashing. Temperature readings kept climbing. Yet somehow, Mason looked completely calm. One engineer pointed at the monitor. "The engine temperature is rising." Mason nodded. "I know. And you're saying that's normal?" "Yes." The room looked confused. Veronica stepped forward. "Explain." Mason walked to the main display screen. For a moment, he studied the data. Then he pointed at a graph. "What does this sensor measure?" One engineer answered immediately. "Core engine temperature." Mason shook his head. "No." The engineer frowned. "That's exactly what it measures." Mason crossed his arms. "Then why does it disagree with every other sensor in the system?" The room became quiet. Several engineers looked back at their screens. For the first time, they noticed something strange. The warning sensor showed overheating. But every secondary sensor showed normal operating temperatures. One engineer's eyes widened. "Wait." Another engineer quickly checked the calibration records. Then another. The atmosphere changed instantly. A senior technician suddenly stood up. "Oh no." Veronica looked at him. "What is it?" The technician swallowed. "This sensor was replaced during year 1 of development." The room froze. Another engineer opened old maintenance records. A few moments later, his face turned pale. "We've been using the wrong calibration values." Silence. Absolute silence. For 3 years, every major design decision had been based on data from a faulty testing configuration. The engine wasn't overheating. The testing system was reporting false readings. One engineer collapsed into a chair. "You're telling me we've been redesigning a perfectly good engine for 3 years because of a bad sensor?" Nobody answered. Because everyone already knew the answer. Yes. That was exactly what had happened. The room felt surreal. Millions of dollars. Thousands of work hours. Hundreds of redesigns. All because of a single incorrect calibration setting. Veronica couldn't believe it. The project they had abandoned wasn't fundamentally broken. The data was. Mason quietly watched as the engineers verified the results. One by one. Every test confirmed the same conclusion. The engine had been capable of success much earlier. The company had simply trusted the wrong information. A few moments later, the final endurance test continued. Hour 4. Perfect. Hour 5. Perfect. Hour 6. Still perfect. The engine performed beyond expectations. The engineers began smiling. Then laughing. Then celebrating. For the first time in 3 years, Phoenix X had completed a full endurance cycle. Without failure. Without overheating. Without shutdowns. The project was alive. But as the celebration began, an unexpected visitor entered the facility. The room gradually fell silent. A black luxury sedan had just arrived outside. Several executives immediately recognized it. Their expressions changed. Veronica's smile disappeared. "What is he doing here?" Mason looked through the glass windows. A tall man stepped out of the vehicle. Expensive suit. Confident posture. Sharp expression. The founder of Titan Velocity Motors. Blackstone's biggest competitor. And judging by the look on his face, he already knew something important had happened inside the building. The celebration inside the testing facility stopped almost immediately. Everyone turned toward the entrance. The man walking through the doors was Richard Kane, founder and CEO of Titan Velocity Motors, Blackstone's largest competitor, and one of the most aggressive businessmen in the automotive industry. Richard smiled as he entered. But it wasn't a friendly smile. It was the smile of someone who believed he had already won. "Veronica." Veronica folded her arms. Richard. The tension in the room was obvious. The two companies had competed for years. Every major contract. Every major investor. Every major project. Their rivalry was legendary. Richard glanced toward the running Phoenix X engine. His expression changed slightly. For the first time, he looked concerned. So the rumors are true. Veronica smiled. What rumors? Richard ignored the question. Instead, he looked directly at Mason. The small-town mechanic standing beside the engine. You must be Mason Carter. Mason nodded. That's right. Richard studied him carefully. Then he laughed. I expected someone different. Several executives exchanged uncomfortable looks. Mason remained calm. Richard walked around the engine. For a few moments, he examined the performance data. The numbers were impressive. Very impressive. Then he turned back toward Veronica. Congratulations. The word sounded forced. Veronica smiled. Thank you. But Richard wasn't finished. He reached into his briefcase and removed a folder. Then he placed it on the conference table. I'd like to make an offer. The room became silent. Veronica frowned. What kind of offer? Richard pointed toward Mason. Him. Everyone froze. Richard continued. Come work for Titan Velocity. The room erupted in whispers. Mason looked surprised. Richard smiled confidently. I'm prepared to offer you $5 million. Gasps filled the room. $5 million. For a mechanic from a struggling garage. Richard wasn't done. A private research facility. A full engineering team. Any resources you need. The room could hardly believe what it was hearing. Richard stepped closer. What do you say, Mason? The offer was extraordinary. Life-changing. The kind of opportunity most people only dreamed about. Everyone waited for Mason's answer. Veronica looked nervous for the first time all day. The engineers looked worried. After all, Mason had just saved their entire project. Losing him now would be devastating. The room remained silent. Finally, Mason spoke. That's a generous offer. Richard smiled. I know. Then Mason surprised everyone. But I have a question first. Richard nodded. Go ahead. Mason looked directly into his eyes. How did you know the project was working again? The room froze. Richard's smile disappeared. Just slightly. But Mason noticed. So did Veronica. The atmosphere changed instantly. Mason continued. The test finished less than an hour ago. No public announcement has been made. No reports have been released. He took a step forward. So how did you know? Nobody spoke. Richard remained silent. For the first time since entering the building, he looked uncomfortable. Veronica slowly turned toward him. Her expression hardened. Because she had realized something. The timing wasn't a coincidence. Richard hadn't come because of a rumor. He had come because someone inside Blackstone had informed him. Someone had leaked confidential information. Again. The room suddenly felt very different. This wasn't just about an engine anymore. There was another secret hiding inside Blackstone. And this time, the evidence was standing right in front of them. The room became completely silent. Richard Kane's confident smile was gone. Every executive. Every engineer. Every employee in the facility was now staring at him. Mason repeated the question. How did you know? Richard remained calm. But only on the surface. Inside, he knew he had made a mistake. A small mistake. The kind of mistake that reveals a much bigger problem. Veronica stepped forward. Answer him. Richard forced a smile. I have contacts in the industry. Mason shook his head. No. The room remained silent. The test finished less than an hour ago. There wasn't enough time for industry rumors. Veronica's expression darkened. Because she knew Mason was right. Richard had arrived too quickly. Far too quickly. A security manager immediately began reviewing internal communications. Minutes later, his face changed. Then another manager's face changed. Then another. The atmosphere became tense. What is it? Veronica asked. The security manager swallowed. We found something. The room froze. A senior executive sent a message 23 minutes ago. To whom? The manager looked toward Richard. Then back at Veronica. To Titan Velocity Motors. Gasps spread across the room. The evidence was undeniable. Someone inside Blackstone had leaked confidential information. Again. The executive responsible was quickly identified. His name was Thomas Reed. Vice President of Strategic Operations. A trusted employee. A respected leader. And apparently, a very expensive mistake. When confronted, Thomas eventually confessed. For 2 years, he had secretly shared information with Titan Velocity. He believed Blackstone's project would fail. And he wanted to secure a future position at Richard's company. The betrayal shocked everyone. Especially Veronica. She had trusted Thomas completely. Richard realized the situation was getting worse by the second. Without another word, he closed his briefcase. Then stood up. I think it's time for me to leave. No one stopped him. No one needed to. The damage had already been done. Over the following weeks, Blackstone's success became national news. The Phoenix X engine exceeded every expectation. Investors returned. Contracts poured in. Production began. Within months, the project became the most successful launch in company history. The engine that everyone had abandoned became a symbol of innovation. And surprisingly, a symbol of humility. Because everyone knew the truth. The breakthrough hadn't come from a famous engineer. Or a giant corporation. It had come from a single father running a small garage. One afternoon, Veronica visited Mason's repair shop. The same tiny building most people drove past without noticing. Lily was helping organize tools after school. Customers filled the parking lot. Business had never been better. Veronica smiled. Looks like you're busy. Mason laughed. A little. She looked around. Then handed him a folder. Mason opened it. Inside was an offer. A permanent position at Blackstone. A large salary. A leadership role. And enough money to change his life forever. Mason read it quietly. Then closed the folder. Veronica smiled. I already know that look. Mason laughed. You do. You aren't interested. Mason nodded. I'm not. Neither of them seemed surprised. Veronica sat down. Why? Mason looked around his garage. At his customers. At his tools. At Lily laughing with one of the employees. Then he smiled. Because this is already my dream. For a moment, Veronica didn't speak. Then she nodded. She understood. Success wasn't always about earning more money. Sometimes it was about building something meaningful. Something that belonged to you. A year later, Blackstone opened a new technical training program. And they named it after Mason Carter. The Carter Fellowship. Designed to help talented mechanics from small towns gain opportunities in engineering and technology. Hundreds of students applied. Many would go on to build remarkable careers. All because one person refused to believe that greatness only existed inside giant companies. As for Mason, he continued running his garage, helping customers, raising Lily, and solving problems that others thought were impossible. Because the truth was simple. The CEO's dealership gave up on the engine. The experts gave up on the engine. The investors gave up on the engine. But a single dad didn't. And sometimes, the difference between failure and success is simply the person who refuses to quit.